As we reach the end of 2025, I want to take a moment to speak plainly about this year. What it meant for me, and what it meant for Haskaria. I'm not interested in dressing this up with dramatic language. This is simply a chance to look back at what actually happened and why it matters. Before I talk about renewal or progress or any of the major steps we took this year, I need to acknowledge where we came from, because the truth is 2024 broke me in ways I still haven't processed yet. Losing my home and family in a fire, dealing with the spiritual collapse that followed, it drained me. Took the ground from out underneath me. And Haskaria at that point was little more than a scattered idea trying to survive alongside me. I'm mentioning this not for sympathy but for context. You can't understand the importance of this year unless you understand the condition I walked into it with. 2025 didn't start strong. It didn't start with vision or energy or confidence. It started with damage control. It started with the simple goal of trying to get my feet under me again. Leadership doesn't come from pretending everything's fine. It comes from acknowledging when things aren't fine and choosing to keep going anyway. That was the reality of this year, and I want anyone who listens to this to know the truth of it. But even with everything that fell apart in 2024, something shifted in 2025. And that shift wasn't small, it had even changed me. And because of that, it changed this nation. This year wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about putting on a show. It was about steadying myself, rediscovering my purpose, and rebuilding the structure of this nation piece by piece. This year-end address is important because Haskaria is still young. We don't have centuries of tradition or long records of national speeches behind us. Every step we take now will shape the culture and character of this empire for generations. And reviewing a year like this isn't just symbolic, it's a way to mark a turning point. It's a way to say this is where we finally started moving forward again. So that's what I want to do tonight. I want to walk through the story of 2025, not with flowery language, but with honesty. What we survived, what we built, what we restored, and what we're preparing for 2026. Because this year wasn't just another chapter. It was the year we stopped drifting and started rebuilding. And that deserves to be said clearly. This is our year in review. The story of Haskaria's renewal. Coming into 2025, I wasn't in a good place. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. The year before had taken most of the energy and strength I thought I had. Losing the house and my family in 2024 didn't just take property or people, it took the stability I'd built my life on. And when that fell apart, a lot of things fell with it. I entered this year tired. Spiritually tired, mentally tired. Tired in ways I didn't even know how to explain at the time. And honestly, I still don't. I felt like I was trying to rebuild myself on ground that wouldn't stop shifting. No matter how hard I tried to steady myself, it felt like my feet kept slipping. There were days I didn't feel like praying, days where I felt numb, days where I wondered if I was even capable of leading anything, let alone an entire nation. I felt suffocated, spiritually, emotionally, mentally. It was like I was breathing underwater. And I think the hardest part was I knew I wasn't completely lost, but I wasn't found either. I was just suspended, waiting for something to break the silence. But then something happened that came back to me that I can't explain in any other way except to call it mercy. Not the kind you feel instantly, not the kind that hits like lightning. It was quieter, slower, more patient than I deserved. But it was real. One moment in particular changed everything for me. And I've said this before, but I'll say it again, because it matters. That was the moment when, before we were going to the fire, we were pulling up our driveway, or the road to our house, and I was praying, and I audibly heard God speak to me. I will never leave you nor forsake you. I am your God. And this was at the time before the fire was revealed to me, before we came up the hill and seen the damage that we saw. Now, when I remembered those words, whenever I thought on those words, it brought peace to my life. When God spoke these words, I'm going to be honest, that hit harder. That hit harder than anything I'd heard in years. That wasn't an encouragement. It wasn't comfort. That was an anchor. It stabilized me. It got me under my feet again. And that moment didn't erase every problem I had, but it changed the direction I was walking. That's when renewal started. Not as a big emotional explosion, not as some dramatic transformation, but as a steady return to life. A slow rebuilding of strength. A gradual clearing of the fog that had been sitting over me for so long. Renewal wasn't a concept this year. It wasn't even a theme. It was something I actually lived. I had to dig myself out of a pit piece by piece. I had to relearn what faith felt like after a long drought. I had to rebuild my confidence as a leader. Renewal became a rebirth, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, and once that happened, everything else began to fall in place. And it really brought to mind, I don't know the scripture, there's a place in the Bible where it talks about becoming a new creation in Christ. It talks about being renewed and, reborn. And that's not just going from a sinner to a saint. It's going from broken to whole. It's talking about wholeness. And another place in the Bible talks about a peace of mind. This year I had to relearn what faith felt like after a long drought. I had to rebuild my confidence as a leader. Renewal became rebirth, mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. And once that happened, everything else began to fall in place. And here's the thing I realized. Haskaria could not renew unless I renewed. A nation is shaped by the condition of the one leading it. And once I got my footing again, once God steadied me, the direction of this empire changed almost immediately. That renewal became the foundation for everything that came next. The cultural rebirth, the identity work, the media expansion, the radio, the book of renewal. All of it started with God restoring me first. This was the year of renewal because I needed renewal. And Haskaria needed me to be whole again so the nation itself could finally begin to rise. Before Haskaria could rise, I had to walk through something I wouldn't wish on anyone. And I need to talk about it plainly. Not for sympathy, but because it shaped everything that came after. In 2024, when the house burned, I lost more than a building. I lost family. I lost years of stability, memories, and the place that grounded me. Watching your home and family members vanish in flames is something that changes you. It strips away the illusion that life is secure. It forces you to face the reality that everything you rely on can disappear in one night. And when that happened, my spiritual strength didn't hold up the way I thought it would. I hit a low point, the lowest I've ever been. It's my rock bottom point in my life. There were nights I felt completely disconnected from God. Not angry, not rebellious, just empty, just exhausted, just numb. When people talk about a dark night of the soul, I used to think that was dramatic language, but then I lived it. I questioned everything, my calling, my purpose, even my place in God's plan. It wasn't dramatic in the theatrical sense, it was just slow, grinding kind of collapse. And during that time, Haskaria wasn't growing, it wasn't progressing, it wasn't even really surviving alongside me. But then something happened in the middle of all of that. And I've only had a handful of moments where I felt God speak into a situation directly. And that was one of them. It wasn't loud, it wasn't emotional, it wasn't surrounded by music. It was calm, clear, steady. And I already said this, but God said, "I will never leave you nor forsake you, for I am your God." And the moment I heard that, everything shifted. That didn't instantly fix my life. It didn't rebuild my home. It didn't bring my family members back. It didn't erase the personal battles I still had to fight. But it did something more important. It gave me footing again. It gave me something solid to stand on when everything else had burned away. And that moment, that exact moment, is where Haskaria's true beginning started. Not in a document, not in a flag, not in a national plan. It began when God steadied me. The personal fire became a catalyst for everything. The book of renewal, the rebirth of national identity, the structure we built this year, the direction we're taking next year. It all came from that turning point. Leadership isn't about strength in the easy moments. Leadership shows itself when everything collapses and the leader has to stand back up anyway. And here's the truth I learned the hard way. A nation rises or falls. A nation rises or falls with the condition of the one leading it. When I was broken, Haskaria stalled. When I was renewed, Haskaria came back to life. That's not ego. That's simply the reality of building a nation from the ground up. The fire that nearly ended everything became the fire that started everything. And that's why this empire carries the symbol of the phoenix. Because renewal isn't just an idea to us. It's the story we were born from. When renewal finally took root in my life this year, something else started happening alongside it. The national spirit of Haskaria began to come back to life as well. It wasn't forced, it wasn't something I sat down and tried to invent, it was something rediscovered. There came a point in 2025 when I realized Haskaria wasn't just a personal project anymore. It wasn't a hobby or a creative outlet, it was a collection of ideas. It had a purpose, a real one. And that purpose wasn't simply to exist, it was to answer a calling. A spiritual calling. Haskaria was born out of renewal, not ambition. It came from a moment of clarity after everything else had burned away. That's why the national spirit we build this year feels different from anything else we've tried before. It wasn't engineered, it wasn't manufactured. It grew naturally out of what God had restored in me first. That's where the phoenix comes from, not as a myth, not as a fantasy creature, but as a metaphor for divine renewal. For the reality that something can fall apart completely and still rise again through the mercy of God. The phoenix isn't a mascot. It's a reminder of what we've lived through. When people see that symbol, I want them to understand that it's not there to be flashy. It's there to declare that this nation didn't begin from strength. It began from ashes, and there's power in that. In the early stages of a nation, identity matters more than anything else. You don't have land yet. You don't have citizens in the thousands. You don't have a full government structure. What you do have is identity. And identity is what sets the foundation for everything that comes after. That's why symbols matter so much. People underestimate it, but the truth is, flags, emblems, mottos, they shape how people feel. Humans respond to symbols long before they respond to laws or policies. A flag can inspire unity. A motto can focus a generation. An emblem can remind you of who you are when you're at your lowest. Think about any great nation or movement in history. Before they had armies, before they had infrastructure, before they had a recognition, they had a symbol, a banner to gather under, a voice to follow, a purpose to reclaim. And that's why the work we did this year mattered more than most people will ever understand. We didn't just organize files or design graphics. We built the psychological background of Haskaria. We created the identity that future citizens will inherit. And that identity will shape their loyalty, their pride, and their sense of belonging. This was the year the national spirit came back. This was the year the Phoenix became more than artwork. It became a declaration, a reminder, a purpose of who we are, and what we survived, as well as what we're rising into. This is the rebirth of our national spirit, and it will carry us into the years ahead. One of the most important things that happened in 2025 wasn't political. It wasn't administrative. It wasn't about laws or land or structures. It was cultural. Because if there's one thing that history makes painfully clear, is this: no nation survives without a culture strong enough to hold it together. This year, Haskaria began building that culture, deliberately, thoughtfully, and with a sense of purpose. This creation of our national symbols was the first sign of that awakening. And I don't mean symbols in the clip art of logos. I mean symbols in the historical sense. Marks of identity. Marks that carry weight and define who we are. The phoenix, the imperial style, the national colors, the motto, the Haskarian anthem. These weren't thrown together, they were chosen because they reflect what this nation was built from. Renewal, faith, duty, and the willingness to rise after collapse. Every empire in history understood this. Rome had its eagle. France had its fleur-de-lis. The United States has its stars and stripes. Nations anchor themselves in images that outlive the people who create them, because symbols strengthen memory, and memory strengthens loyalty. When we revived the imperial style this year, the aesthetic, the tone, the dignity, it wasn't about theatrics. It was about giving Haskaria a visual language. Something people could look at and say, yes, this is us. It may sound small to outsiders, but choosing how a nation looks, how it speaks, and how it presents itself is the beginning of culture. Culture doesn't appear magically. It's shaped. It's cultivated. And 2025 was the year we began writing the first chapters of Haskarian culture in a real, lasting way. This was the year we began formatting the national tone and voice, the way we speak about renewal, the way we present the empire, the way we carry ourselves in public messages, videos, radio broadcasts, and official statements. All of that matters more than people realize, because a nation can have brilliant laws and strong ideas, but if it has no culture, no sense of identity, it will fall apart the moment hardship strikes. Culture is the glue. Culture is what makes 1,000 strangers feel like brothers and sisters. Culture is what lasts long after leaders pass on. That's why this year mattered. Before Haskaria can build its land, its institutions, its government structures, it must build its identity. That has always been the order of nation building. Symbols first, story first, culture first. Because those are the things that survive that transition. Those are the things that unify people who haven't even met yet. And that's exactly what happened in 2025. We established the cultural backbone of this empire. We gave it voice, tone, imagery, and meaning. And years from now, when Haskaria is far larger than it is today, these early cultural foundations will still be visible. They will still be recognizable. They will still matter. 2025 wasn't just the year we found renewal. It was the year we found ourselves and began shaping what it means to be Haskarian. One of the most meaningful accomplishments this year was the release of the Book of Renewal. And I want to be clear, this wasn't written to be a piece of creative writing or a casual project. It was written to serve as one of the foundational texts of this nation. The Book of Renewal has a purpose. It exists to explain the philosophy, the spirit, and the heart behind Haskaria. It puts into writing the ideas that shaped this nation before we had laws, land, or citizens. It captures the story of how renewal changed me, and how the same renewal can shape an entire people. Spiritually, it represents the moment God pulled me back from collapse. It documents the experiences of being rebuilt from the inside out. And that matters because nations don't survive on politics alone. They need a moral foundation. They need a sense of meaning. They need a story worth believing in. Nationally, the Book of Renewal is our first real national text. The closest thing we have to a guiding text, other nations began with constitutions, some began with manifestos, some began with declarations. We began renewal, because renewal is the reason Haskaria exists at all. Renewal is our declaration. The writing process wasn't easy, it wasn't fast, it forced me to go back through memories and moments I'd rather have ignored, but putting those words onto paper helped me understand who I was becoming, and who Haskaria was meant to become. It shaped me while I was shaping it. And the influence this book will have on future citizens is greater than most people realize right now. Years from now, when people join this nation and want to understand what it came from, this will be one of the first things they read. It explains our foundation, it explains our symbol, it explains our purpose, it explains our identity. It will guide people long after I'm gone, and that's why it matters. The Book of Renewal isn't just a book, it's the first pillar of Haskaria's national spirit. And I genuinely believe that years from now, people will look back at these early videos, the first speeches, the first broadcasts, the first documentaries, the first Haskaria year in review, and see the beginnings of something much larger. These early steps in media laid the groundwork for how we will educate, inform, unify, and inspire future citizens. Haskaria Media Group will become one of the pillars of the empire, and this year was the year that voice began to rise. One of the most unexpected but important developments of 2025 was the creation of Haskaria Radio. And I want to explain how it came about, because it wasn't planned in a boardroom, it wasn't something I wrote on a checklist at the beginning of the year. It came about from a moment of inspiration, and honestly a deep sense of nostalgia. I've always been fascinated by the way people used to gather around a radio. In the 1940s, 50s, and earlier, families didn't used to tune in for noise or background entertainment. Radio was an experience. It was the heartbeat of a household. News came from those speakers. Music came through them. National updates came through them. Comfort came through them. And the sound of those old broadcasts carried a dignity modern media usually lacks. Always lacks. That era inspired Haskaria Radio. I wanted a space where people could sit down, even for a few minutes, and feel connected to something bigger than themselves. A place where the nation spoke with clarity, purpose, and warmth. When I sat down and began writing the format, something clicked. I realized that radio wasn't just a creative idea, it was the missing cultural piece of the empire. Nations need a voice. They need a tone. They need a channel through which their spirit speaks. Haskaria Radio became that. And our first major broadcast, the Christmas special, reflected that. It wasn't just a holiday program. It was the first time Haskaria sounded like a nation. It had structure. It had sponsors. It had scripture. It had culture. It had identity. It had the weight of something real forming right in front of us. From that point on, I understood that this station is going to play a long-term role in the empire. It will become our archive of sound, our method of preserving culture, our way of teaching new citizens about who we are and what we believe and where we're going. Even decades from now, when we look back at Haskaria's earliest years, the broadcasts from this period will still be important. They'll show how we spoke, how we thought, how we prayed, how we led. Radio has a way of capturing the soul of a nation that video sometimes doesn't. And that's why Haskaria Radio matters. It isn't just entertainment, it's cultural preservation. It's national memory. It's a way to pass down identity from one generation to the next. And every broadcast we create, from the big ceremonial ones to the weekly dispatches, adds another layer to the story of the empire. Haskaria Radio was born this year, and I believe it will become one of the most important institutions in our nation's history. One of the biggest shifts in 2025 was that Haskaria finally stepped out into the open. For years, this nation existed in ideas, documents, private conversations, and quiet planning. But this is the year we entered the wider micronational community in a serious, visible way. We started engaging publicly, joining servers, participating in conversations, interacting with other leaders, and taking part in broader discussions about diplomacy, legitimacy, and development. And once we showed up consistently, people noticed. Haskaria wasn't just another name floating around. It started building an identity that other nations could recognize. This public presence was strengthened by our campaigns and messaging. We began shaping how we present ourselves, not loosely, not inconsistently, but with a unified voice. Our video statements, symbols, and national projects all started telling the same story. Haskaria is a nation with purpose, direction, and structure. And I want to make something clear. Legitimacy doesn't happen overnight. It isn't handed to you. It's built through consistency, clarity, and genuine effort. Every piece of content we produced this year contributed to that legitimacy. Every appearance, every public post, every document, diplomatic exchange helped shape the perception of Haskaria as an emerging empire, not a temporary experiment. We took the first steps into diplomacy, real diplomacy, not just introductions but relationships, communication with micronational leaders, learning the landscape, building reputation, establishing trust where it mattered. That's how nations grow. And all of this expanded our presence online. Haskaria is no longer something tucked away in private folders or hidden chats. People can see us. They can hear us. They can recognize us. Our name is starting to circulate. Our message, Reclaim the Future, is starting to take root. 2025 was the year Haskaria stopped hiding. It was the year we stopped treating ourselves like a private idea and began acting like a real nation with a real mission. And that mattered because the moment a nation stops hiding, it starts growing. This is the year the empire stepped into the world. One of the most meaningful decisions we made this year was to shift to a new calendar era, the post-renewal era. And I want to explain why that matters, because it wasn't just a gimmick or a decorative idea. It was a deliberate reorientation of our national story. Throughout history, nations have reset calendars during defining moments. Rome measured time from the founding of the city. Japan marks eras according to the reigns of emperors. Christianity reshaped the global calendar with the birth of Christ. Even modern revolutions like France in the 1790s created new eras to reflect overwhelming change. These transitions weren't cosmetic. They marked the moment when a people said, "This is where our real story begins." For Haskaria, that moment is renewal. Not the founding year on paper, not the first time the name was used. The real beginning came in 2025. The year everything turned around. The year I found direction again. The year the nation regained its identity, purpose, and spiritual footing. 1PR represents that turning point. It marks the moment where the empire stopped drifting and began slowly rising. And there is psychological power in a new beginning. Humans don't move forward when they're chained to the weight of what we used to be. People need markers, moments in time that tell them, the past doesn't define you anymore. The future starts here. And that's what the post-renewal era is for Haskaria. It marks the break between collapse and restoration, between wandering and building, between the old world and the world we were creating now. And when future citizens look back hundreds of years from now, they won't count time by the fire of 2024 or by scattered early projects. They'll count from the moment renewal reshaped the nation. The Empire's timeline begins here, with purpose, with clarity, and with God-given direction. As we step out of 2025 and into 1PR, or 2026, I want to be very clear about the next year and what it represents for Haskaria. If 2025 was the year of renewal, the year where everything came back to life, then 1PR 2026 will be the year of foundations. When I say foundations, I mean that in three separate but connected ways: spiritually, culturally, and administratively. All three matter. All three determine whether nations stand or collapse. And all three are focused on the year ahead. Spiritually, the foundations of 1PR/2026 are about stability. Renewal brought me back to life. But foundations are about consistency. It's one thing to be revived, it's another thing to be anchored. The coming year is where I commit to strengthening my own walk with God, strengthening my discipline, and keeping myself grounded so the nation isn't led out of exhaustion or emotion, but out of clarity and conviction. Culturally, foundations mean shaping identity before anything else. We started this work, the symbols, the style, the voice of the empire, but 1PR is where these things get organized, documented, standardized, shared in a way the future citizens will understand. Nations with strong foundations don't guess who they are, they define themselves clearly. 1PR is about finishing that cultural backbone so something becomes inherited, not improvised. Administratively, foundations mean structure. This is where we begin formalizing the systems that will support the empire, the basic constitutional frameworks, the organizational documents, the charters, the early ministries, the planning, and the long-term documentation that transforms a personal effort into a national institution. It's not glamorous, it's not dramatic, but this is the work that determines whether Haskaria becomes a real nation or remains an idea. 2026, or 1PR, is where we begin building the machinery of the empire piece by piece. Early goals for Q1 reflect this: the calendar reset, the cultural documents, the Phoenix Guard minimum viable product, the restructuring of media, the charters, the early groundwork for the Guildonomics system. These are not side projects. They are the cornerstones of the nation. And speaking of Guildonomics, this is one of the biggest long-term structural pieces we will be establishing next year. Guildonomics is not just an economic philosophy, it's the system that will define work, purpose, stability, and the community within Haskaria. It gives people direction, it gives industries identity, and it gives the empire a framework for future growth. And above all of this, spiritually, culturally, administratively, is my role as emperor. And I want to be honest about the promise I'm making. In 2026, or 1PR, I'm committing myself to build with integrity, discipline, clarity, and consistency. I'm committing to show up, to put in the work, to treat this nation like something real, because it is real. And as we say goodbye to 2025, we're not closing a chapter, we're marking the point where everything changed. This year will always be remembered as the year of renewal, The year Haskaria found its direction. And now we step into 1PR, the first year after renewal. The first year post-renewal, and we step into it with purpose, with identity, with structure, and with God's guidance. To every future citizen of Haskaria, to everyone who has walked with me so far, to everyone who believes in what we're building, this is your charge. Carry the flame. Honor the renewal that brought us here. Stand firm as we build the foundations of an empire that will outlive all of us. Goodbye to 2025. Thank you for the renewal. Now the real work begins. And as always, reclaim the future.